Welcome back. Tonight's story is about a corporate secretary in Wilmington who watched her husband's business partner forge her name to cut her out of a seven-figure buyout, smiled through the closing dinner, and then walked into the next board meeting with the original bylaws no one knew she still had. Pour the coffee. Stay close. My husband's partner forged my signature to steal me out of my own company. I was the one who wrote the rules. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 44 years old. I live in a narrow brick townhouse on the south side of Wilmington, North Carolina, with a kitchen that smells like coffee grounds and the salt that drifts up from the river 2 blocks down. I am the corporate secretary of the company I helped build in 2014, a small commercial real estate firm called Caro and Whitfield Holdings. On a Tuesday afternoon last September at 2:14 p.m., a courier handed me a thick manila envelope on my front porch. The return address was a law firm in Raleigh I had never heard of. I stood there in my slippers, holding it against my chest, and I could feel my own heartbeat in my fingertips. Inside that envelope was a buyout filing. Inside that filing was a resignation letter from me, dated 4 months earlier, signed in my handwriting, a handwriting I had not put on that letter. I have never resigned from anything in my life. I sat down on the top step of my porch and I started laughing. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh a woman makes when she finally understands the last 10 years of her marriage. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I want to know who is with me on this one. To understand how I ended up on that porch, you have to understand what our life looked like from the outside. From the outside, we were the couple every middle-aged neighbor in our cul-de-sac quietly resented. My husband, Bennett Whitfield, was a former commercial banker turned real estate developer. 6'2", silver at the temples by 38. He had a laugh that filled a room and a way of touching the small of my back at dinner parties that made other women look at their own husbands and wonder. His business partner, Grayson Caro, was the opposite. Compact, quiet, watchful. The kind of man who carried a fountain pen in his breast pocket and remembered the name of every waiter who ever served him. People said Bennett was the vision and Grayson was the spine. They built a small empire on small office buildings and strip centers up and down the Cape Fear coast, and our names went on the door because I had spent 6 months in 2014 building the company from a stack of state filings on my dining room table. Inside the house, the picture was different. Bennett had a way of making me feel like an employee on her best day and a house guest on her worst. He would call me sweetheart in front of clients and then come home and explain, very calmly, that my opinion on the new Leland property was based on emotion rather than data. Grayson never raised his voice in our home. He did not have to. He would sit at our dining table on Sunday nights with that fountain pen behind his ear, watching me refill his glass, and he would say things like, "Eleanor, you have the most beautiful filing system I have ever seen." And both men would laugh, and I would smile, and I would refill the glass. There were warning signs. There are always warning signs. The first one was in 2017 when I caught Bennett moving $42,000 from our joint account into the company operating account without telling me. When I asked him about it, he kissed my forehead and said, "Ellie, we own the company. It is the same money, just a different pocket." The second was in 2021 when Grayson sent me a birthday card. A handwritten card. I want you to remember that birthday card. He had signed his full name in dark blue fountain pen ink, all the loops and slants of his very particular hand, and he had written, "To the woman who keeps us legal." I had laughed and tucked the card into the bottom drawer of my desk under a stack of old certificates of good standing. I did not know yet that I had just been handed the weapon that would end his career. In the spring of 2024, the men started acting strange, quieter at dinners, more polite to me than they had been in years. Bennett brought me flowers on a Wednesday. Grayson sent over a bottle of something French. They stopped arguing about the Brunswick County deal in the kitchen. They started having those conversations in the garage with the door pulled down. I told my sister Margaret about it on the phone, and she said, "Ellie, men do not get quiet for no reason. Men get quiet when they are planning something. 2 weeks later, they took me out to dinner. It was a Friday. A restaurant on the river called Renly's, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a maitre d' who knew our names. Bennett wore the navy suit I had picked out for him 3 Christmases ago. Grayson wore that little fountain pen in his breast pocket. They ordered a bottle of wine I did not recognize, and over the second glass, Bennett reached across the table and took my hand. He looked at me the way he had looked at me at our wedding. He said, "Ellie, we have something we want to talk to you about. There is a private equity group in Charlotte that wants to buy a majority position in the firm. $42 million. They want Grayson and me to stay on for 3 years. They want you to be free, to finally rest, to finally do whatever you have been wanting to do. Travel. Write that book. Open the little flower shop you always talked about in 2009. I sat there and I felt something warm spread across my chest. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, my husband had described me as someone with her own dreams. I said yes. I said it twice. I said it before the entree arrived. Grayson smiled at me over his wine glass with those small watchful eyes, and he said, "Eleanor, we will take care of everything. You will not have to lift a finger." And I believed him. That is the part I still cannot forgive myself for. I believed him. The next 4 months, I felt like a woman who had finally been given permission to exhale. I started looking at flower shops on the west side of town. I priced a small cooler. I went to a paper store on Castle Street and I bought 3 blank notebooks because I thought I might actually write the book this time. Bennett booked a long weekend for us in Charleston in August and told me that closing was going to be in early October and that he wanted to spoil me until then. He called me his good girl. He used the words "our future." He had not used the word "our" since 2019. On a Tuesday afternoon in September at 2:14 p.m., a courier handed me a thick manila envelope on my front porch. I want you to picture this carefully because I have replayed it in my head every single night for 8 months. The light on the porch was the soft gold of early fall. The smell was the cinnamon broom my neighbor Doris had just hung on her door. The temperature was 73 degrees because I checked the weather on my phone 6 times that afternoon, trying to make my hands stop shaking. The courier was a young man with a small tattoo of a sparrow on his wrist. He said, "Are you Eleanor Whitfield?" I said yes. He said, "You need to sign for this one, ma'am." And he handed me the envelope, and he left, and I sat on the top step of my porch because my legs would not carry me back inside. The envelope was from a Raleigh law firm called Holcomb and Bean. Inside was a 140-page document titled Notice of Equity Transfer and Buyout Filing, Caro and Whitfield Holdings, LLC. On page 63, I found a letter on company letterhead. It was addressed to Grayson Caro as managing member. The first line read, "Please accept this as my formal and irrevocable resignation as a member and officer of Caro and Whitfield Holdings, LLC, effective May 15, 2024. The last line read, "I waive all rights, claims, and interests in the pending sale of the company." The signature at the bottom was mine. The loops on the E. The little hard stop on the T. The way I always slant the W backward because my 5th grade teacher in Greensboro told me to. It was my handwriting. And I had never written that letter. I sat on that porch for 40 minutes. I did not cry. I did not call Bennett. I did not call Grayson. I did not call my sister. I sat there and I let my brain do the math of the last 6 months. The flowers on Wednesday, the bottle of something French, the garage conversations, the phrase "our future," the dinner at Renly's where my husband had described my dreams to me as if he had finally seen me, when really he had been describing the shape of the cage he was about to lock me out of. They had not been planning a buyout for me. They had been planning a buyout from me. $42 million, and my share of it, by their forged math, was 0. The man I had married had sold me for paperwork. The man with the fountain pen had held the pen. I went inside. I locked the front door. I poured a glass of water. I sat at my kitchen table and I said out loud, to no one, to the empty house, "Eleanor, you wrote the bylaws yourself." and something in my chest went very, very quiet. A neighbor saved me that night without ever knowing it. Her name was Doris Pelletier, 67 years old, a retired paralegal from a firm in Charlotte who had moved to Wilmington in 2018 to be closer to her grandson. Doris had hung the cinnamon broom on my door that afternoon because she hung one on every door on our street every September. She walked over at 6 o'clock with a foil-wrapped pan of corn casserole because she had seen me sitting on the porch, and she had not liked the look of my face. She knocked. She did not come in. She just stood on the welcome mat with that casserole, and she said, "Eleanor, honey, you have the look of a woman who just opened something she was not supposed to open. Do you want to talk, or do you want me to leave the food and go home?" I had been trained, by Bennett, by Grayson, by 10 years of being the woman who refilled the glass, to say I was fine. I opened my mouth to say I was fine. What came out instead was, "Doris, can you read something for me and tell me if I am crazy?" She came in. She sat at my kitchen table with her reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she read the resignation letter twice. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she took her glasses off and she folded her hands and she said, "Eleanor, this is a forgery, and whoever did it does not know who you are." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Honey, a forger picks an easy mark. They picked the wrong filing cabinet. Doris stayed until 11 that night. She did not let me call Bennett. She did not let me call Grayson. She made me drink a glass of water. She made me eat half of the corn casserole. She made me write down, on a yellow legal pad, every single thing I knew about the company. The date of incorporation, the state of formation, the provision in the operating agreement that required wet ink signatures from both founding members on any equity transfer. The clause I had written myself in 2014 on a Tuesday night at my dining room table because I had read a horror story in a trade journal about a woman in Atlanta whose husband had transferred her shares with a digital signature while she was at her mother's funeral. I had told Bennett that night, "I will not let that happen to us." He had laughed and kissed my forehead and said, "Ellie, you are paranoid. Put it in. I will sign anything you want." He had signed it. So had Grayson. In wet ink fountain pen blue. In a bound book of original bylaws that lived in a fireproof safe in the back of my home office closet. A safe Bennett had not opened in 9 years. A safe Grayson did not know existed. If you have ever had a man in a Navy suit describe your dreams back to you the night before he sold you for paperwork, drop a 1 in the comments. I want to know I am not alone in this. I did not confront them. Not that week. Not that month. I went to a lawyer Doris recommended, a woman named Patricia Hadley in a small office on Market Street who had spent 30 years prying women out of marriages and partnerships that had been built to bury them. Patricia read the buyout filing. Then she read my operating agreement. Then she set both documents side by side on her desk and she looked at me over her glasses and she said, "Eleanor, do you understand what you have?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Honey, you wrote the cage, and then they tried to lock you in it, with your own key. That key does not fit anymore, not without the original." For 3 months, I lived 2 lives. In one life, I smiled at Bennett. I laughed at the right places. I served him his coffee with 1 sugar and a splash of cream. I let him take me to Charleston for the long weekend, and I watched him touch the small of my back in the lobby of the hotel, and I let him think I was still the same woman he had married. In the other life, I drove to Patricia's office twice a week. I made copies. I had handwriting analysts in Raleigh authenticate the forgery. I had Grayson's birthday card from 2021 examined under ultraviolet light and confirmed as the source document for the scanned signature on the buyout filing. They had lifted his signature off a card he had written to me. The same man who had told me on my birthday that I was the woman who kept them legal. I built a folder. I named it, in my own private little joke, the Cage Key folder. It went everywhere I went. It rode in the passenger seat of my car. It slept in my nightstand. It came with me to Charleston in a tote bag Bennett never thought to open. I found a small apartment on the north side of town in November. I paid for it in cash from a personal account Bennett did not know I had, an account my late mother had opened for me in 1998 with $3,000 and a note that read, "Every woman needs walking out money." I moved one box a week into that apartment on Tuesdays when Bennett was at his Rotary lunch, a change of clothes, my grandmother's iron skillet, 3 blank notebooks I had bought on Castle Street thinking I would write a book. A rescue cat named Margaret, named after my sister, who had told me on the phone men do not get quiet for no reason. By February, the apartment was furnished. By March, I was ready. The closing was scheduled for April 14, 2025, at 10 a.m. at the offices of Holcomb and Bain in Raleigh. On April 13th at 9 p.m., I told Bennett I was going to my sister's for the weekend in Charlotte. I packed a small bag. I kissed him on the cheek. I locked the front door behind me for the last time, and I did not look back at the cinnamon broom that Doris had hung again on my door that September. I drove to Raleigh. I checked into a hotel. I laid out a charcoal gray suit on the bed. I laid the cage key folder on the desk. I slept for 4 hours, and I did not dream. At 9:55 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the conference room at Holcomb and Bain. Bennett was already at the table. Navy suit, the one I had picked out for him 3 Christmases ago. Grayson was at the table, fountain pen in his breast pocket. There were 3 lawyers from the Charlotte private equity firm, 2 paralegals, and a notary. There was a stack of signature pages. There was a bottle of sparkling water in the middle of the table and a small bowl of mints. The room smelled like clean carpet and printer toner. The temperature was 68 degrees, because corporate conference rooms are always 68 degrees, and that is the temperature at which a woman in a charcoal suit can keep her hands from shaking. Bennett looked up when I walked in. The color drained from his face the way it had drained from my face on the porch in September. He said, "Ellie, what are you doing here?" I did not answer him. I walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, the one no one had pulled out because no one had been expecting me. I set the folder on the table. I did not open it. Not yet. Patricia walked in behind me. She set the original bylaws book on the table beside the folder, bound in dark green leather, wet ink fountain pen blue on every page. She set down a second envelope with the handwriting analyst's report, a third with the forensic finding on the birthday card, a fourth with the affidavit from the notary in Raleigh who had been told the resignation letter had been signed in his presence, when in fact, on May 15, 2024, I had been in a dentist's chair in Wilmington getting a crown replaced, with a time-stamped receipt and a credit card statement to prove it. I looked at Bennett. I looked at Grayson. I spoke very, very quietly, the way you speak to a child who has just broken something they cannot afford to replace. I said, "Gentlemen." In 2014, I sat at my dining room table on a Tuesday night, and I wrote a clause into our operating agreement that requires wet ink signatures from both founding members on any equity transfer. I wrote it because I had read about a woman in Atlanta whose husband sold her shares while she was at her mother's funeral. Bennett, you told me that night I was paranoid. You told me to put it in. You told me you would sign anything I wanted. So I want you to look at me now, and I want you to remember what you said to me at Renly's last spring. You said you wanted me to finally rest, to finally be free, to finally do whatever I had been wanting to do. Grayson, you said you would take care of everything, that I would not have to lift a finger. So I did not. I lifted a folder instead. I slid the folder across the table to the lead attorney from the private equity firm. He opened it. He read the first page. He read the second. He looked up at Bennett and Grayson with the careful blank face of a man who has just realized he is about to lose $42 million in a single morning. The notary stood up and walked out of the room. One of the paralegals dropped her pen. I said one more thing before I left. I said, "Bennett, you told me on a porch in 2014 that I was paranoid. You were wrong. I was the woman who kept you legal, and I kept the original. I picked up my purse, I walked out. I did not slam the door. I did not look back. The closing did not happen that day. It has not happened since. If you have stayed with me until now, thank you. Tell me in the comments what part of the story stayed with you the most. The drive back to Wilmington took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I-40 East, through the long flat stretches of pine and tobacco country, with the spring sun coming in low through the driver's side window. I did not turn on the radio. I drove with both hands on the wheel, and somewhere outside Goldsboro, I started talking out loud to the 24-year-old girl I had been when I drafted those bylaws on my dining room table. I told her I was sorry it had taken me this long to use what she built. I told her she had been right to be paranoid. I told her that the men who described her as paranoid were the men who needed her to be. I told her that being unwanted by men who built their lives on her labor was not the same as being unworthy of the life she had quietly built for herself in the back of a fireproof safe. I told her that the flower shop was still possible. The notebooks were still blank. The walking out money her mother had left her in 1998 had done exactly what her mother had named it to do. I pulled into the parking lot of my new apartment on the north side of town at 1:47 p.m. Margaret the cat was waiting in the kitchen window. The cinnamon broom on the door was one I had hung myself. I went inside. I sat at my own small table. I opened one of the 3 blank notebooks from Castle Street. And on the first line of the first page, in my own wet ink fountain pen blue, I wrote the date. April 14th, 2025. And one sentence under it. I am the woman who kept the original.